Okay, welcome everyone. Thank you for joining us for this very important discussion around safeguarding WA's EPA and environment. I would like to begin tonight's session by acknowledging country, that we first of all are on stolen land. CCWA respectfully acknowledges the Whadjuk people of the Noongar Nation, along with the traditional owners of all countries where it works. We pay our respects to elders, past and present. CCWA seeks to always walk alongside our Aboriginal partners, recognising their continued connection through land, sea, culture and community. I would also like to encourage all of us tonight to continue our learning about the history and the culture of the First Nations peoples from the country on which we live. And also, importantly, I would like to acknowledge everyone and thank everyone that's joining us tonight for this very important discussion. It's a tough sector that we work, volunteer, and just reside in. We seem to be continually pummeled with bad news, but we do this work out of a place for love. So I thank you everyone for joining us tonight. I just need to start off official proceedings with some housekeeping. Just a note that we are recording tonight's session. We do have quite a few people who are registered that will be catching up with the session later on. So please, if you do not wish to be recorded at any time, please turn your camera off. Second note is that please remain on mute throughout the presentation. Unfortunately, we don't have the capacity to unmute everyone with the numbers that are on board tonight. So thank you for your understanding on that front. And in relation to that, please post any questions that you do have throughout the night into the group chat. We do have several moderators on board tonight who will be collating those questions for a Q&A section later on. There's also scope within the chat for people to answer those questions in the chat room itself. So appreciate that. So this is a quick overview of the agenda of what we're going to go through tonight. You are currently sitting through the welcome and introduction. Then we'll be joined by Mick Davis, who's the chair of the WA Landcare Network, followed by Richard Yin, who will be speaking. Richard is the CCWA president. And our final speaker for the night is Ruby Hamilton from the Environmental Defenders Office WA. She'll be taking us through a review of the WA environmental approvals processes and procedures. We hope to finish that little section off around 6:30, and then we'll have approximately 15 minutes for a Q&A session, which will be facilitated by Dylan, our membership coordinator, and then a separate 15 minutes and an interactive discussion on a collective from.
So now you need to get the volume up somehow.
Yeah.
If I could just ask everyone to remain on mute, that would be most appreciated. Thank you. Okay, so we are here tonight because according to the government and the business sector, the EPA is moving far too slowly, judging it as overly complex, time-consuming and costly. So the Cook government plans to legislate an overhaul of the EPA following a review of the environmental assessment process. This review released 39 recommendations to the government, and these recommendations and public comments from the government have raised various concerns amongst environmental groups and also just social justice groups and the public at large. So most importantly, while we're here, we need to show solidarity in our response as an environmental movement and as the public. We're going to try and reach some broad agreement on where we want to go on this and how we want to work together in response to these developments. And just a quick note that these developments that have been put forward will take approximately 6 to 12 months to come to potentially come to fruition through legislation and such. So that is a fair bit of time, but it's still vitally important that we have a swift and strong response from the environmental sector in WA on these points. So just on the role of the EPA, it was established in 1971 as an independent body in that it is not subject to direction by the Environmental Minister or anyone else, and its advice to government is public. The authority's operations are governed by the Environmental Protection Act from 1986, which stipulates that the objective of the EPA is to use its best endeavours to A, protect the environment, and B, to prevent, control and abate pollution and environmental harm. So its objective is not to fast track industrial projects, it is to protect the environment. And some of their more specific roles include conducting environmental impact assessments, preparing statutory policies for environmental protection, preparing and publishing guidelines for managing environmental impacts, and providing strategic advice to the Minister for the Environment. So just final slide before we do get to our speakers. This is just a brief top liner of what we want and expect our environmental assessment process to be. That being, we need our environmental assessment process to be rigorous, science-based, independent, and consultative. So to speak more about this and why it is under threat, I will now pass over to our speakers. And our first speaker for the night is, in fact, Mick Davis. Mick is the chair of the WA Land Care Network, and we are most appreciated that he has given us time, or his time tonight, to speak to us on this front. Mick plans to speak more about why it is important for us to present the EPA as a positive and why we need to strengthen these processes. So I'm going to hand over to Mick. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, and hopefully we're coming through loud and clear. Look, as chairperson of the WA Land Care Network, I'd like to say a big thanks for coming and having a chat today. I'm certainly also very keen to acknowledge the Whadjuk Noongar people on whose land I'm standing today, and acknowledge our elders past and present across all country. Our members at the WA Land Care Network, we look after our lands and our seas across the country, and certainly we've been doing that for 10s, 20s, 40s of years. There's nothing compared to our First Nations folk. And, you know, we're standing on the shoulders of amazing people who knew how to look after country. So the recent moves by the WA government to overhaul West Australia's environmental assessment system, fast-tracking mining, making objections to the Warden's Court more onerous on our community, and seeking to make changes to the EPA process really do signal a concerning future for our environment. And that's one that we've got to confront. We can't stand by and because industry and government think it's the right thing to do. We need to add community's voice, community's loud voice, and it's great to see so many people here doing that. It's a time when many of us, they want to see action to protect our environment and to tackle climate change, and there seems like there is so much more that the WA government can do. There's a need for our voice as community in those important decisions, and sometimes it's starting to feel like they're not wanting to listen to that voice. And, you know, these decisions impact all of us now and the future. And yeah, I think they're going to hear quite a loud voice in the very near future, and I do hope they do. So community consultation is essential. It's essential in forming good policy and good governance and good programs that support our economy and our environment. And we know that, and the government knows that. This is a time for community to have more of a voice and not less. And certainly, whichever way you cut it, it seems to be that we are shouting loud but not being heard. So it might come to a point where we need to keep talking and shouting. There is no doubt that there are some good decisions being made. It's better than it was. There are certainly opportunities for the WA community to see better protection. The government can do a little bit and sit on its laurels, or it can do what they know to do, and that is to protect our biodiversity our forests, and our community's economy. There's more to our economy than just mining. Let's not forget about things like tourism, for example. We need more, not less. It's not a time for us just to be accepting the bare minimum that government is offering us, or appears to be offering us. So through our network of around 200 member groups and about 150 associate members, we understand the effort that goes into protecting our environment and the natural bounty that our environment presents. And it's worth protecting, not destroying. Once it goes, it's possible with our forests to walk through oceans, places to go to and connect with our country, with our world-renowned biodiversity and plants and animals that are so unique here in WA. We are going to have a lesser place if we don't protect it. And again, our government needs to hear that. And if we let that happen, we will be lesser to our environment and our communities. So these proposed changes that threaten projects that have been undertaken by people on country to protect sites, to protect and provide cockatoo habitat. They threaten waterways where groups have protected erosion or undertaken erosion activities. They threaten to remove wildlife habitat, sometimes and more increasingly species that we haven't even discovered. So, you know, this is stuff that we need to experience now and have our future generations able to. I'm really excited that we're all here today. I want to encourage people to consider talking about the positive, the opportunities. We need to hold our government accountable to what the EPA was originally designed for and help them understand we need a full commitment, not a partial commitment, not a half effort, but let's give them a really clear idea. Sometimes we spend time saying we don't like what you do. Let's show them that we're collectively powerful than government, than industry. There's more to this than money. You know, we need to consider our future, our natural heritage, and the fact that we can't accept our community is going to be ignored. So I'm really glad I wrote some stuff down because it could have gotten really, really impassioned. I think we need to use logic and information to help them do a much better job. I would encourage you all to work through your member groups, individually make your concerns known, and certainly support CCWA in the fight that they're leading by pulling us all together. Just an example today. So thanks very much. Short and sharp, and hoping that we can hear some great solutions coming forward.
Great. Thank you so much, Mick, for your impassioned speech and for joining us tonight and giving us your time on this important topic, and just highlighting how important it is that we highlight to the government that the EPA needs to be strengthened, not weakened, and how much of an important process it really is. Just a note that Mick will not be able to join us for the Q&A. He is in high demand tonight and has to get to another meeting. So thank you and farewell, Mick. See you soon. Our next speaker for the night is Dr. Richard Yin. Richard is the president of CCWA. He is also the deputy chair of Doctors for the Environment Australia. Richard collated a swift and stern response to the news last week, and he will be giving an overview of the impacts on our sector and of CCWA's initial response. Over to you, Richard. Thank you so much for giving us your time tonight.
So thank you all for coming. The fact that you're all here in what is usually one of the busiest times of the year, and where most of us are feeling pretty exhausted, just speaks to the importance that I think you all are giving to this issue. And I think you're right to be concerned. The proposed changes to the EPA represent some of the most radical changes in environmental assessment laws that we've seen in decades. And importantly, they were put forward without any public consultation. They are clearly designed to accelerate environmental assessment processes rather than to ensure that our environment is protected. They are clearly weighted to support industry and not our environment, fauna or flora, undermining the very purpose of the EPA. The EDO are here to provide more details about the review processes and recommendations. But what I want to do is just give you a little bit of a context about these recommendations. I think it's important to understand that this decision has not been made in isolation. It comes on top of a decision to allow Alcoa to continue operations while being environmentally assessed for its actions that threaten our drinking water. It comes on top of a climate change bill that is really a fig leaf for inaction with no 2030 emissions reduction target and no mandated target. It comes on top of a likely decision where the Burrup Pipe Extension, Australia's largest fossil fuel project, will be approved despite creating emissions that will drive up further warming that already threatens our southwest forest. So this is a government that is clearly putting profits ahead of a safe and protected environment that we all care about. CCWA will continue to be a lead voice in confronting a government that is undermining environmental protection and really, to be quite frank, undermining democracy through a lack of transparency and accountability to its people and to the science. But we clearly can't do it without you. To confront these challenges requires that we all use our rights and our power to engage with our MPs and decision makers and make this dissatisfaction known. And they need to know from within their communities that what they're doing is unacceptable. And we all have powers as constituents and we need to be using it. There's really no hiding that there are a lot of headwinds coming our way. But I believe that collectively we can change the current course of this government, that they understand that their constituents value our natural environment and want it protected for future generations. But it requires all of us to be mobilizing, activating our friends and our groups within our communities. So I look forward to hearing what EDO have to now say to give us more detail.
Thank you so much, Richard, for your input on this very important topic. And thank you so much for recently becoming the president of CCWA. Your contribution to this sector is invaluable. And thank you for highlighting just now just how important the WA environment is and the leading role that EPA, a strong and robust EPA plays in protecting our unique and wonderful environment. Just finally, now our last speaker for the night is the esteemed Ruby Hamilton from the Environmental Defenders Office. Ruby will be giving a review of the environmental approval process and procedures in WA, and then delving into a quick recap of the review and recommendations that was made last week in the commission report by the government. So I'll pass over to you, Ruby. Thank you so much for joining us tonight.
Thanks, Liam. Thanks for having me tonight. And thanks also, Richard and Mick, for your really valuable contributions to this. Yeah, I'll be running through a quick review of the review. But before that, just setting out what our existing environmental approvals processes and procedures are. So my name is Ruby Hamilton and I'm a solicitor at the Environmental Defenders Office as well in the Safe Climate team, and I'm based here in Boorloo in Perth. So to start off with, I want to acknowledge that we're on Whadjuk Noongar Boodja. That was more difficult than it usually is for me. And I acknowledge the elders past and present. This is my sort of boring slide that is a disclaimer of this talk, that the content today is legal information and it's not legal advice. If you need any legal advice and assistance, you can visit our website. EDO is a community legal centre specialising in public interest environmental law. So with the boring stuff out of the way, and it's not often you say that before you start talking about a review, but if we go to the next slide, I can give some background to this review. So it was commissioned in late October 2023, and it really does focus on proponents and speeding things up. It was a short, sharp review of the environmental approvals process, and had, as previous speakers have noted, pretty limited consultation. The review report itself hasn't actually been published, but the government's response to the recommendations of the review was published on the 12th of December. So that's available online, the little photo of it up there on the screen. But yeah, obviously a very short process involved there. So just in terms of background of what our existing environmental assessment and approvals framework is, and what this review was focusing on, just a quick little overview of the main sort of bodies within the framework under the Environmental Protection Act, or the EP Act. So obviously we have the Minister responsible, the Minister for Environment, that's Reece Whitby, and he also holds the portfolios of climate action and energy. That's the Minister responsible for the Act. And then you have the department that sits under the Minister, the Department of Water and Environmental Regulation. This is the regulator and the department that is responsible for day-to-day government operations in this area. Then we have the Environmental Protection Authority, which Mick and Richard have already discussed as being its role within the EP Act and within protecting the environment in WA. It's an independent expert body, and its main function is environmental impact assessments. Then the other sort of interesting element in that framework is the appeals convener, who many on this call I'm sure will have heard of and interacted with, but is a bit of a off to the side often. It's an independent government office which investigates appeals against particular environmental matters, including reports from the EPA. So the reasons that we've touched on that will become clear later as we delve into the recommendations. But I'll just give a quick overview of the current process, which is the next slide. And these are now color coded so that the next flowchart will kind of make a bit of sense, hopefully. It starts off with the referral to the EPA of a proposal, and then it moves on to the next step, which is the EPA conducting an assessment and publishing a report on a proposal, its environmental impacts and recommendations of whether that proposal should be approved and any conditions. And so at the next stage, that report can actually be appealed by any person. Lots of people on this call have lodged those appeals in the past, and those are investigated with the appeals convener's office. The next step, though, is that it's actually the minister who makes the decision on that appeal. And the minister then, in the next step, will make a separate decision in conjunction with other members of the government on whether to approve the proposal, which is the next step in that flowchart. And then finally, once a proposal has been approved, the last step in this overview flowchart is that the department then acts as the regulator. It undertakes any enforcement of conditions on those environmental approvals. So with that in mind, and knowing that that's the framework that the recommendations focused on, I can move to sort of summarise the recommendations. They were mostly administrative, so the review mostly went into things that can be done without actually changing the law. Of course, we would say that any legal changes that might have been recommended by the review should certainly be subject to proper scrutiny. And that should include consultation of the WA community, experts, before those are progressed, as everyone on this call, I think, would agree with. The focus of the review is primarily directed to facilitating quicker and less onerous assessment processes. And like our previous speakers tonight have said, this does definitely raise some tensions because the overarching purpose and objectives of both the EP Act and the EPA are fundamentally to protect the environment. So, for example, one of the recommendations, recommendation 6, would see the EPA change its focus to facilitating sustainable development, whereas its statutory purpose is to protect the WA environment and to prevent, control, abate and mitigate pollution and environmental harm. So again, most of these recommendations, we see they're really tailored to speed up decision-making, which is not necessarily bad, but it's certainly angled towards being more convenient for industry. And the review was not angled at facilitating better decision-making or better protection of the environment for all Western Australians. For example, recommendation 18A foreshadows a limit on the EPA's ability to request information from proponents when needed for an assessment. And so we certainly say that some of those changes that seem to undermine the fundamental objectives of the EP Act and of the EPA should be reconsidered. But before we get to all of the bad recommendations, we can focus on a few of the good recommendations because it's not all bad news. Some of the recommendations are centred on increasing the EPA's resources, which would enable it to undertake assessments and make decisions in a timely and effective way. So several of these recommendations would benefit everyone, as well as promoting faster and better processes and wouldn't need legislative change. So we have a few recommendations that focus on recruiting and developing staff at the EPA and the department and improving the culture. A couple of recommendations which focus on increased resourcing as well in particular. Then we also have some recommendations that focus on improving coordination in government and recommendations that focus on expertise and data that is available in environmental impact assessment. So we certainly would say that those recommendations should be implemented where they don't compromise protection of the environment in accordance with those objectives of the EP Act and the EPA. But of course, there are some concerning recommendations in there, and I'm sure a lot of people on this call are concerned about them, and that's why you've joined tonight. So the first recommendation that the EDO is highlighting as being concerning is recommendation 36C, so really buried in there. But this recommendation actually proposes removing all public appeal rights against EPA assessment reports and moving some public appeal rights on the conditions on licenses from the minister to the State Administrative Tribunal, or the SAT. So currently, any person, including any member of the public, can lodge an appeal against an EPA assessment report or conditions on a licence. And those are the appeals that are usually heard by the Office of the Appeals Convener and then determined by the Minister. So those appeals really do provide an opportunity for the public to participate in, and also specifically to improve environmental assessments and decision making. So, for example, the EPA will often strengthen its recommended conditions during the course of an appeal and in response to matters raised in appeals. No other reviews of the EP Act have ever recommended that appeal rights should be removed. And I'm sure a lot of people here will also know that there have been many reviews of the EP Act over the years, subject to very comprehensive stakeholder input. And then, you know, this review that was done in 6 to 8 weeks and seems to have only consulted industry, all of a sudden has recommended removing these appeals. In our view, the appeal process isn't a drain on the department's or the EPA's time and resources. It's conducted by the Office of the Appeals Convener, for one thing, and so it remains within the Minister's remit. And we actually can see from previous reviews that have found that removing appeal rights wouldn't have practical effects in reducing assessment times. And those are the government's own reviews. We do think that the SAT might be an appropriate body to hear some of the appeals under the EP Act. It's a well-established independent tribunal with some expertise to handle merits appeals. But any move to have appeals heard by the SAT should certainly not be at the expense of those public appeal rights, which are so important in the scheme of the Act. So in particular, we would say that legal changes to remove those public appeal rights are pretty unnecessary, counterproductive, and that concerns can be handled through simpler and less radical measures. So moving on to the second dot point there, another concerning recommendation to us is recommendation 32, another one pretty deep in the list of recommendations. And this recommendation kind of suggests that the EPA should defer to other agencies and other parts of the government when it's assessing greenhouse gas emissions and social surroundings as environmental factors. Now, the greenhouse gas emissions environmental factor obviously covers climate impacts and how the EPA assesses those. And the social surroundings factor actually includes the EPA's assessment of impacts on cultural heritage and values, including Aboriginal heritage. So sort of some kind of, you might say, the more controversial or the more public interest type factors there. So in response to that recommendation, we would say that limiting the EPA's remit to assess and make recommendations on these really important environmental factors only serves to hamper informed decision-making and proper regulation. So we certainly would say that the EPA, with appropriate resourcing and technical expertise should retain and strengthen its functions in respect of greenhouse gas emissions and social surroundings. So the final dot point here, the final concerning recommendation that we want to highlight is recommendation 38. They really did put all of the questionable ones towards the end. This recommendation seems to direct the EPA to defer to the Commonwealth Safeguard Mechanism instead of undertaking its comprehensive own assessment and recommendations pursuant to the objectives in the EP Act when it comes to greenhouse gas emissions. A lot of people on this call will be completely familiar with the Safeguard Mechanism. It's a federal policy which is intended to bring down the emissions of large emitting facilities in line with the Commonwealth's emissions reduction commitments, including under the Paris Agreement. So obviously the Safeguard Mechanism isn't really directed to the protection of the WA environment at all. And that is actually the purpose of the EP Act and the objective of the EPA. So the WA government has implemented its own climate change and greenhouse gas emission policies, regardless of, you know, how we might wish that they were a bit stronger. But we certainly would say that the government should retain its regulatory powers to deliver on its own policies. And so rather than simply substituting in the Safeguard Mechanism for the EPA's assessment of greenhouse gas emissions, if there are real concerns about duplication, these can be addressed in quite simple and common sense regulatory practices. So things like reporting requirements or incorporating the Safeguard Mechanism into existing EPA guidance would certainly be simpler than that recommendation. So those are the main concerns that I wanted to highlight. And I'll finish up by just talking about the sort of priorities for next steps, because I know that everyone wants to take action on this, and it's really great to see so many people invested. So the first thing is that we obviously understand the review didn't consult any stakeholders other than industry. So for example, there's been no opportunity for public comments. There doesn't appear to have been targeted consultation. And that means like First Nations voices, technical experts, environmental organisations haven't had a say on this. Given the role of environmental assessments and approvals and the protection of the environment as a public asset for all Western Australians, EDO would say that public participation is a democratic necessity here, and that also input from technical experts, including environmental NGOs, is really necessary to ensure the highest quality review of these processes. So we would definitely say that the positive changes like those that I identified earlier, which would increase the EPA's capacity, enable it to undertake assessments and make decisions well, those should be welcomed and those should be implemented. But it's really important to call out those key concerning recommendations, and they do present quite radical and regressive changes, including legislative changes, that those should be reconsidered. So we know that effective and efficient operation of the WA Environmental Assessment and Approvals Framework and consistency with the fundamental objects of the EP Act and of the EPA are really important, and that those shouldn't be compromised by implementing those concerning recommendations. Our understanding for now is that the recommendations sit with government, and that work will begin imminently on implementing those recommendations which have been accepted, and the government's response, whether they've accepted or just noted individual recommendations, is all in that document. But essentially for now, it really is a matter of directly showing the government which parts of those recommendations we don't agree with, and really speaking up on how we need to protect our environmental assessment and approvals framework and make it operate in the best possible way, not just for industry, but for all Western Australians. And now the last slide here, I think, has some general contact details. That's our website, which includes fact sheets and that sort of thing for general information about environmental law and policy. And then we also have some contact details there as well. Back to you, Liam. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Ruby. Very informative presentation there. Congratulations. You have a great skill at taking dense and complex information and presenting it in a very understandable way. It's very appreciated. I'd just like to add a little bit from those 39 recommendations. A lot of the ones, obviously we can't speak about all of them tonight, but a lot are just aimed at kind of undermining the independence of the EPA, and also just fast tracking and expediting these assessment processes as well, on top of what Ruby alluded to as well in the concerning section there. So now we are at 6:37. We have about 10 to 15 minutes now. I see there's quite a bit of activity in the chat. We are open for a Q&A session. Richard and Ruby have made themselves available. I can chime in with anything as well. We also have a few other people on the call. Just acknowledging the huge amount of experience and knowledge that is in the crowd today. We might not be able to get to you if you do have something to say, just because there is so many people on the call, we might miss it. But please feel free to chuck anything in the chat. And on that note, I'm going to pass over to my friend and colleague Dylan Storer to facilitate our Q&A session. Thank you, Dylan.
G'day everybody. Thank you very much for being here and for taking part in this very important session. We've got a few questions here already. Just a bit of housekeeping in terms of how the Q&A will work. If you're able to just pop it into the chat as opposed to speaking, just so that this flows a little bit quicker, and then we'll try and keep this Q&A restricted to questions about the proposed reforms, and then we're going to go into a little bit more of a conversation afterwards where we'll be able to unmute ourselves and have that conversation. Perhaps we might start with one straight back to you, Ruby. This one's from Colmar. What legal avenue do we have to challenge the Cook's overhaul of environmental protection?
Yeah, that's a really good question, and unfortunately there's no legal mechanism to challenge a government policy. It really is about using those sort of democratic avenues and emphasizing to the Environment Minister, the ministers who are responsible for this, that you're not happy with particular aspects of it and that you want to see changes that go a different way to these recommendations. So certainly getting in contact with those members of the government and decision makers would be the most legal way to go. But it's already really great to see so many people engaging. And I think that that is a pretty big sign to the government that people aren't really happy with this short, sharp review and its strange recommendations.
Thank you. Nick has a question regarding here. The government was greenwashing the changes, claiming that renewable energy projects are being held up. Does anyone here actually know of any renewable energy projects being held up by community consultation, noting that there's some stuff happening over east, but maybe not necessarily in WA? Wonder if, Liam, maybe if you wanted to.
Yeah, thank you. I don't know if held up is always a negative thing. In this case, yeah, these mining projects are still extractive and can be environmentally destructive, with full acknowledgement that we are in a climate crisis and need to transition to 100% renewables as soon as possible. That doesn't excuse us from the fact that these projects still need to be assessed properly and thoroughly. But on that specific question, I'm sure that, yeah, and I hope that most renewable projects are going through the strict environmental assessments as well. So yeah, I wouldn't call it being held up at all, just hopefully going through due process as they need to do.
We've got a question here from Jane, and I wonder perhaps maybe Ruby or perhaps even Richard to sort of discuss this, saying additional staff looks good in terms of the proposal, but wondering if there is any concern about the particular skills being sought. I guess, so are we able to sort of speak to what skills need to be represented within the EPA?
Yeah, well, right now there is a provision of the EPA Act which goes to appointments to the EPA. The recommendations do recommend that there's more technical expertise, but doesn't specify exactly what kind of technical expertise they're looking for. So apart from that provision of the EPA Act, which is very general, it's about experience in environmental matters generally. I couldn't speak to specific areas of expertise that are being sought.
It's certainly from my perspective, there's been some concerns regarding the EPA in terms of selection of people within inquiry processes. That in the past, I think have been for myself concerning in terms of who's been selected in terms of an expertise. So, I mean, certainly that is a concern as to what they're deciding and on what grounds they're deciding who actually gets chosen. Again, it's fundamental that the purpose of the EPA should be upheld, and that the members selected are for that reason.
Just thank Dylan. Just one final note on that. Part of the recommendations were to increase the size of the board to a greater amount of members, and I suppose the devil is in the detail as to who those board members are, and if there are any conflicts of interest on that front, which is a pretty big concern of ours at the moment.
Jeffrey raised a concern, just sort of keeping on that discussion about staff, saying concerned about the proposed $18 million on extra staff. It's a question for Ruby. Are they ministerial staff parachuted into the EPA, or does the EPA chair get to choose? Saying very concerned about the former.
Yeah, I can't speak to who they're planning to appoint with that money, but generally the staff in the EPA or in the office of the EPA or in DWER are not appointed by the chair of the EPA. So it wouldn't be a matter of them choosing anyone, but I don't know who they're planning to appoint.
Thank you. Lynn asks, have any of the other states have more environmentally sound protection authority that we can offer up when we make representations to our MPs? And maybe that might be something across the board, but I'm sure Ruby or maybe Richard might have some takes on that.
Well, the WA EPA, like a lot of things in Western Australia, is very unique and exceptional to us, actually. Most other states that have an EPA, they're actually a regulator, so they kind of do enforcement and that sort of thing. We have a very special EPA that is just meant to do basically environmental impact assessments and functions like that within the Environmental Protection Act. So it's not so much as a comparison to other jurisdictions necessarily that would be useful there.
Warwick asks, is the EPA an expert body in the way it is currently constituted?
Under the Environmental Protection Act, there are specific requirements around who is appointed to the EPA. But like I was saying before, it is a very general requirement. So there are no particular qualifications or anything like that required. It's a criteria for appointments being made on the basis of the members' experience in environmental matters generally. So quite broad.
Thank you, Ruby. We've probably got time for a couple more questions, then we'll move into the discussion side of things. June asks, does the review suggest who else would be able to consider social impacts and greenhouse gas emissions if stripped from the EPA? Probably another one for you there, Ruby.
Yeah, no, happy to take that. It doesn't clearly say who should do that, but there is a new provision of the Environmental Protection Act that was introduced in the most recent amendments that allows the EPA to consider other decision-making processes when they assess particular environmental impacts. So I think it's quite clear that sort of flagging that other decision-making processes under legislation that deals with those things might be the sorts of things that take over from the EPA in those spaces. So ideally, if you had, functioning cultural heritage protection laws, that sort of thing, would be able to fulfill the EPA's requirements. But once again, we'd really highlight that the EPA has its own objectives at law, and the purpose of the EPA Act should certainly guide those processes and assessments, and it isn't sufficient to simply defer to another regime, especially if that regime has been shown to be woefully inadequate to manage impacts on those factors.
And probably the last one for Q&A from Karen asks, can you talk more about the importance of timeframes for this, please, including when the key dates to get feedback through before recommendations are implemented?
I can quickly say in terms of the the cold hard facts, there is no feedback being sought. So that means that there's no deadline, but it does mean that it does appear that the government is pretty intent on moving relatively swiftly on a lot of the recommendations. There are in the document that I'm sure will be made available, which lists all the recommendations and the government's responses. It has their timeframes for implementing those recommendations that they're taking up, and a lot of them pretty short. So certainly if it's a matter of providing feedback that you have, I would say do it as soon as possible, even though, yeah, we are coming up to the holiday break. But, you know, I'm sure a lot of people are familiar with these sorts of controversial environmental policy changes and that sort of thing happening close to particular breaks. So yeah, that's, I think, all that we can say in terms of how to get involved in those timeframes.
Wonderful. Thank you very much. And thank you for all of the questions that were sent through. Really appreciate it. We'll move into sort of the next part of this briefing, for the next 10 minutes or so. Just a bit of an open discussion. We'll first just pass back over to Liam, have a bit of a chat about how sort of what CCW has done.
Thank you, Dylan. So this is, yeah, possibly the most important section of the night, and thank you all for sticking around. Just noting we have a brief moment in time until 7 o'clock to kind of raise some thoughts and ideas about how we can respond to this. The whole purpose of tonight to kind of inform and educate people, but also, you know, come together over a shared response and come to some broad understandings about what we need to do and what we should be doing immediately in the short term, but also over a long term, because this is going to be an ongoing battle. Just to raise some quick points about CCWA's thoughts, we'll be sending out the recording of this session. I should note that I think there were some questions we didn't get to. Apologies. We can try and get back to people about that, or feel free to send us an email or give us a call. Also, we've been talking to some member groups already about our response, but very keen to hear from more. And just thinking about things like open letters, specific letters to the Premier and MPs asking for meetings about this very thing, and then taking actions and rallies, you know, out in the streets and doing various stunts or any other things that might be of import to this very important discussion. So now we are going to open the floor up to people. We have some moderators who can help us out with this, but please, can you raise your hand as a Zoom function so that we're not all talking over each other? And I'm going to pass that to Dylan to facilitate this discussion. Thanks, Dylan.
Thanks. I guess we'll go to Jeffrey up front.
Thanks, Dylan. I've just addressed the question that we alluded to just a moment ago. The legal framework, and perhaps addressing this to Ruby as well, the legal framework that permits the Minister to give exemptions to the EPA Act is Section 6, which was introduced by the Gallop Labor government in 2003. And the first Section 6 declaration was to give Alcoa the freedom to clear all the forest without getting a permit under the EP Act, and now because they're getting a squeeze on the EPA assessment of their future activities now, they've suddenly come out with another Section 6 announcement saying they can clear to 2027, despite the fact they're going through the EPA. The real question to you guys and to Ruby is, these are parts of a political campaign, and while ministers are able to just simply put out a decree and it becomes LAW law without any ability to challenge or anything, we always keep getting blindsided by these things. I suspect as part of the End Forest Mining campaign, we'll be pushing hard on that. But I was just wondering what Ruby's thoughts were about the ability to challenge that, and is that the sort of ministerial discretion that appears in other states?
Ruby?
I'm not much of an expert on that section, and it already exists in the law, unfortunately. So it's not a matter of these recommendations adding to that. So I can't really speak to the potential for pushing back on those sorts of decisions, other than the great campaigning that's done by environmental organisations at a democratic level to say that those decisions, when they are made, aren't okay. But unfortunately, the EP Act does make provision for that in the law, and it's really difficult once those things exist to wind them back. Yeah,
well, certainly we can move on, but yeah, those provisions were made by a amendment put by a Labor government way back when, and it benefited no one but a large company. Okay, thanks.
Thank you, Jeffrey. If anyone else has anything to contribute, feel free to pop your hand up. I know there's been a few comments in the chat, so very happy to hand that over and for you to voice those for the sake of the recording, and also so we can have a bit of a discussion on this matter. Other than that, I can go through a few of the chats that have been sent through for feedback. This is particularly in regard to where to next for the environment movement. If you've got any suggestions or thoughts on how we should conduct ourselves in response, what sort of a campaign we should lead, what proposals, what changes we should be proposing to the government, what we should be pushing for. So very keen to hear from you on that. Again, feel free to just pop your hand up, or you can put into the chat if you would like as well, to just suggest that you'd like to speak. So you can put that in the chat as well, and we can go to you, but we'll go to Giz.
Thanks, Dylan. I think we need to be clear, this is a operating blatantly at a political level, and the only thing that's going to impact the Labor ministers who are following the tune of the companies is to threaten them with not getting re-elected. And we are about to move into a 12-month pre-election period. I think yeah, it's almost like the time for being nice we all write submissions, we all do all the right things, but this is taking it to another level, really is. And I think there's got to be some careful thinking about how to target various people in this, because they're the ones who are at the very least being weak in the face of lobbying by industry, but at the worst they're complicit, and there's so much at stake. So I think it's time for us to push back really big, really big time, and I'm happy to be part of planning what that might look like.
Richard?
I just got to wholeheartedly support that perspective. I think a line in the sand has been drawn with this government in terms of a whole number of decisions that have been made. And if we don't stand up now, if we don't take a stance on this, we're just going to be overrun by a whole number of pieces of legislation that are designed to actually override environmental protection and to focus on the profits of companies. So there's a election, both the state and federal election, in just over 12 months. this is clearly leading into a political campaign, and the nature of how we organise must be along those political lines. And at the very least, how we organise ourselves on the ground, I think will be critical. So where you are within your communities, within electorates, you have a power there, and that needs to be built up and supported and networked in such a way that what we bring into the next election is going to be a powerful, connected voice that speaks for the environment. And I don't think there's any other way around.
Palmer.
Thank you. Agree wholeheartedly as well. I also think we need to think about the wider community and the wider public who really don't know, who are probably not aware that there hasn't been any consultation at all. So I also think that would be a really important strand of our campaign, that we're trying to better inform the wider community about what's happening. And I was also with that wondering even about finding out through freedom of information to demonstrate that they never went. With this review, they never went even to the key stakeholders. Thanks, guys.
Thank you, Carla. Ruby, I wonder if you've got any thoughts on whether or how we could utilise freedom of information to assist a campaign on this front.
Yeah, certainly. Freedom of information is a really important way to access information about how the government makes decisions on all of our behalf. And it's accessible to everyone, although I will say it's not very fast. So I would definitely encourage people, if they're interested in finding out information, to use those freedom of information processes. And there are definitely guides on the EDO website as well as on individual departments' websites as well, which is not to say it'll be a super easy process, because it's often under-resourced, takes a long time, can be a little bit complicated, but certainly transparency is so important for things like this, and freedom of information is one way to get there. And so if you're able to make use of those processes, it can be a really important way of holding governments accountable.
Thank you, Ruby. See if there's anyone else who's got anything to contribute at the moment. We're sort of coming right up to 7 o'clock anyway, so a fairly good time to wrap this one up. I think it has been a really important and great conversation to start, and will be the start of what I believe will be a very strong and hopefully successful campaign as well. Thank you all for your contributions. We've also noted down all of the comments in the chat as well, so we'll take that into consideration with the planning and where we go to from next. There will be future meetings of this sort, I'm sure, going forward, and there'll also be more formats coming out of this. We'll send another email out tomorrow, I believe, with a few next steps for everyone that was in attendance today, and also with a link to for you to share with anyone who wasn't able to make it from this recording as well. So yeah, thank you very much from me. If you want to go back over to go Lee. This is bad. We'll go to there we go. Go to Liam.
All right, I'm here. Thank you, Dylan, so much for facilitating that discussion, and thank you to everyone for coming along tonight and contributing. We are far stronger together and far stronger with each other's support. Just to note that this is not the end of the response or the process. This is just the beginning. So I hope you all have an enjoyable break. If you do have a break coming up, please take care of yourselves and of each other, and please stay in touch. Yeah, call us, email us if you have any ideas, if you're willing to contribute to mass responses. This is a super important issue, as it touches on every environmental problem that we have in WA, from fossil fuels to Jarrah Forest to Ningaloo to land clearing, everything. So thank you, everyone. Special thanks again to our moderators online, to Dylan for facilitating some discussion, to Mick, who had to leave us, to Richard, and to Ruby for speaking tonight and answering questions. So very much appreciated.